Welcome everybody to this third webinar on Korea and its population. Today's title is Values versus Material Success in Korea. So we're going to address values, or the sublime why question, trying to understand the internal motives for the current affluence, as well as the shrinking number of babies in South Korea and the world. Korea seems to be the bellwether for the world, not only geopolitically with nuclear threat and rumblings of war, but also in many other areas, like being a crucial meeting place of Eastern and Western thinking. And this program's host, the International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP, was also born from Korea. It's a global interdisciplinary academic project initiated by Universal Peace Federation, UPF, co-founder Dr. Hak Jae Moon. And she commented in her memoir, Mother of Peace, and God Shall Wipe Away All Tears from the Eyes, that selfishness has become commonplace in our world. We enjoy improvements in living standards based on technology, but with each passing day, we are increasingly isolated. We take little personal responsibility for our country, our society, and even our family. The Mother of Peace asked rhetorically, can you imagine the pain God feels seeing humanity, whom he created as his children, living this way? And her advice on page 264 was that we need to learn more about the nature of God, the reality of God's love, and how to live in that love. So our first panelist to discuss material abundance and the fine art of preserving the virtuous soul of a nation, of a loving nation, maybe I should say, is Dr. Eric Richardson. Like all of us, he has been walking this fine line. He graduated from the University of Minnesota Medical School, and after practicing a few years, he felt called to work on peace issues after 9/11, and he helped originating the Universal Peace Federation offices in New York, Tokyo, and Seoul. And he lived in Seoul for 17 years, starting in 2003, reaching out to the diplomatic corps in Seoul through UPF, and also teaching at the Hanyang School of Medicine and the Hanyang Graduate School of Biomedical Science and Engineering. In 2020, he became president of the Wongu University of Oriental Medicine in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he still lives. He is now founder and the current CEO of Resurgent Health of Las Vegas, and still active with peace issues through UPF. Before letting him on and hearing some of his wisdom, just a point that this may bring up some questions, and any questions you have, kindly post them in the chat and we'll address them after all three presentations. So now, without further ado, Dr. Richardson, the floor is yours.
Great. Let me see if I can share the screen here. We should be able to do well. Everybody can see that now?
Yes.
We're good? All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. This question of balancing our material prosperity and the health of our society and our demographic fertility rate and more things like that, I think that's really an existential question. All right. So we want to balance universally revered values and material success. So let's see. These are the core values, right, for UPF. Okay. The universal values, mutual prosperity, interdependence. And what I'd postulate here is that these things are intertwined and they feed on each other, right? But more importantly, there's a root value in there that we teach, okay? And that's to live for the sake of others. So that core value, that root principle of living for the sake of others is something that I'm going to try and pay attention to here, and why that root value is actually part of the social work that we do in trying to establish good families. All right. If we're going to talk about prosperity, I'd really like to make the point. A lot of people talk about wealth or they talk about health, but prosperity, this term for me, brings it all together. We're focused on creating wealth and health, but not just for their own sake, but actually for the purpose of creating a joyful life, right? The purpose of our existence really is to be joyful, right? So when I talk about prosperity, these are the conditions that allow us to thrive and to live in relationships where we feel joy. Okay, we don't need necessarily to have billions of dollars to do that, although billions of dollars wouldn't hurt if we have a right frame of mind. Okay. The importance of family for getting these universal values, because the family is where we learn to live for the sake of others, right? The key crisis for Korea and humankind, to me, is the decreasing centrality of family. Now, Korea's been very strongly focused on the Confucian ethic of family. And UPF has a Christian root, but coming out of Korea, it also has a very strong Confucian root, okay? And in Korean culture, then, these relationships of filial piety, siblings and peers, the parental love relationship, and also the idea that it's multi-generational. It's not just parents and child, but it's actually grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, right? So it's kind of 4 generations, not just 3. And of course, then also Confucius also makes that family then has a connection and a relationship to the society and the nation that it exists in, okay? And that family also then learns to live for the sake of others by living for the sake of the nation and the society. I'm contrasting this with Christianity because Christianity has had this conflict, inherent conflict, because the founder of Christianity never married, right? And so even in the root Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the idea of marriage being a sacrament didn't take root for a long time. And even Paul, St. Paul, wrote in the Bible, he said it's best if you never get married, right? You only get married if you have to. So the other thing I think is the whole idea of multi-generational. Confucius talked about this, but for a lot of people in the world, that is a ideal that couldn't exist, okay? Because the typical lifespan was so short, right? In the United States, you had to be 25 to be a senator. You had to be 35 to be a president, okay? And I think that's because at the time, a lot of people didn't live that long to get that old and to have the accrued wisdom, right? If you could live that long, you probably lived a bit longer, like 50s, 60s, right? Maybe 70s. Now we're commonly going to 80s, 90s, the fastest growing segment of our population, that's people over 100, right? Percentage-wise. You may not have known that. Okay. So this existential question is the idea also, what does it mean to be fully human? And the founder of UPF has made a point that to be fully human means to involve all the stages of development, from being a child to being an adult and becoming a spouse, and then becoming a parent, and then becoming a grandparent. And when you look at the stages of their life, you can actually see that they followed that rule themselves, that certain levels of what they proclaimed to the world followed those stages in their own lives, right? At the social, cultural, and humankind level, this sustainment of family is essential to the continued existence of our society, culture, and even humanity. So I think a lot of people are starting to think about this. We've been pushing this idea of overpopulation for a long time, and people that are very serious about it, like the zero population growth kind of group and people, those kind of people have been very serious about it. So I remember back in the 70s reading an interview with the head of zero population growth in Mother Earth News. And at that time, they said very clearly, we plan to cut the population. And one of the ways that we plan to cut the population is to promote homosexuality. Okay. So this necessity of continuing human lineage for the existence of humanity is a very important concept. Now, Elon Musk recently made the point that he doesn't think we're facing an overpopulation crisis. The real population crisis is going to be population implosion. Okay. So our question is can we make material prosperity and universal values congruent? And my assertion is that you can't not make them congruent. The two things are inseparable. Okay. So for Korea, what's the current situation and how can mutual prosperity be attained? Let's see, where am I at? Okay, so Korean economic prosperity. It's another thing I think that a lot of people aren't really aware of. They're born into a prosperity and into a wealth and indeed into a health that just has never existed in human history before. It's never existed. And so they really think that this is the status quo and that this is the way things have always been and should be. And if you look at it, it's just not. And so if you go back 100 years, Korea, like most people of the world, they lived in poverty. Most of the people in Korea lived in poverty, okay? And even though they were not as bad off as some places in the world, they were bad off. And they are also doubly bad off in that a lot of their possible progress as the world modernized was under the Japanese oppression at the time. Okay. So I don't know if you know or not, but in 1954, at the end of the Korean War, Korea was ranked literally as the poorest nation on earth, right? They're poorer than Sudan or Chad. Okay. That's pretty poor, but they came out of that. And since that time, Korea's advanced to be one of the richest nations on earth. And my assertion was, or is, that the reason that they were able to do that is because they had this cultural tradition rooted in the Confucian family ethic and influenced by Christian ethics of individual values. So you have both of these, right? So an individual person has value, an individual person has the capability to progress and self-actualize in a sense, and they are still connected to that family root, right? So they're taking care of their parents. The parents are taking care of the children. They treat their peers as younger brothers and younger sisters. And they're convinced about multi-generation, right? The idea that this is a lineage that extends over time. So the Korean demographic glyph, staff have made a point that I don't really need to go into that, so I'll just refresh it, right? The point is, just to maintain the population as it is in its current structure, then the fertility rate needs to be 2.1. North Korea says it has a fertility rate of 2.1. Do we believe them? I don't know. Anyway, Korea's fertility rate has been less than 1.4 for about 2 decades. In the last few years, it's been 1.0 to 1.1. Demographers say no culture has ever come back from a sustained fertility rate of less than 1.4. And Korea is not alone. All right, I was listening to somebody talk who wrote a book about China recently. He made the point that China's, because of its one-child policy and where it's at right now, China's facing an implosion that's incredible. There's 1.4 billion people in China now, but they predict by the end of the century, it'll only be 500 billion. Okay. So I would assert that Korea can't maintain its current prosperity as it faces population collapse. They're acting, you know, from my experience there, they're acting a lot like their population will never collapse. You know, they're continuing to invest in education, they're continuing to invest in apartments and more, and in roadways. And that infrastructure will be unnecessary if they continue their current demography. The other thing about their current, about this kind of population implosion is that as the population falls, the people that are left are older and older. So the question of how we got here, and I suggest that one of the reasons is this influence of modernity, right? So this has tipped at the prioritization of family and society first, right? So that what should be this living for the sake of others, in reality, in my viewpoint, it's not bad at all to develop yourself, but the purpose of developing yourself is so that you can better live for the sake of others, right? But in a lot of the world now, it's really focused on the self, right? And so it's focused on the self to the detriment of wanting to get married, of wanting to have children, of caring about your parents. There's a story about Keynes, the economist. And basically Keynes, people warned him about the economic policies he was setting in place, that in the long run, they would be very bad for people. And Keynes said, well, in the long run, we'll all be dead. Okay. And then I learned that Keynes was actually gay. And so that's an essential truth. If you don't have a lineage, if the lineage stops with you, then in the long run, we'll all be dead. So who cares? But for a lot of us, that purpose of life goes forward in our children and offspring. In Korea, I realized that hometown has a meaning for Koreans that Americans just don't get, right? They can trace their clan back for hundreds of years in their hometown. In America, you know, like I vaguely know that my parents, my great grandparents came from Liverpool somewhere, right? And that's about it. And I know the region where they moved to when they came to America. So this loss of hometown was very important. You know, this connection to family was rooted in that. And in the last 50 years, they've largely moved to urban centers. Okay. And so now this multi-generational model of existence has evolved to be no family or a nuclear family alone. Material prosperity enables us to separate from nature. This is another problem. And it's a big problem in Korea. Well, it is in America too. We've convinced people that in order to exist in our society and our culture, if you really want to be something, you have to go to college, you have to go to the university, and you should be doing these really academic things in our lives. And as an academician, then what can I say? but we've convinced people that that's true. Okay, so in Korea, this is absolutely true. They have one of the most highly educated populations in the world, but a lot of the kids can't get jobs. A lot of the graduates from universities. Okay, they view this as being freed from what they call 3D jobs, right? Triple D jobs. They're difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs. And the way that they've gotten around to having to have some of those still exist in their population is by importing people from other countries to come do them. Okay. The last one is the changing role of women. And I think in the past, women are so essential in terms of they're the ones who reproduce, right? They're the ones who raise the children. And we've convinced a great number of women that if they're going to be mothers, that's like a waste of time. You need to be something else. You're not really fully a person unless you do that. In the past, that was kind of cemented in because for a lot of women, they had no way to support themselves in a family without a male, right? Without a husband. But now, for a lot of women, through education and through the way that the society has evolved, it's possible for them to live without a husband, okay? In my experience, if you really talk to people who are saying, well, I'll never get married, and you start talking to them about why, then it's the experiences of their past and seeing other people's marriages and seeing how, women were treated. But if you really talk to them, they still want it, right? They still want that. They still want marriage and family.
Okay, so, Dr. Richardson, can you bring it to conclusions? We have some time for discussion.
I certainly can. So the last point I'd like to make about that is that many men still expect women to be like their grandmothers and grandmothers and that they stayed home and that the men, in a sense, could abuse them, right? And the women don't want that. This false image of equality, I think, for a lot of women, what it means to be equal is to be just like a man rather than being a woman. Okay, and I don't think that's right. How can we have prosperity that corresponds to our universal values? And we go back to the root. Okay, we need to have intentional education about parenting and family, right? And how to be good spouses to begin with, how to take care of each other, how to be good parents, and how to raise our children to be good children. So we need to really develop clear, intentional education to make that happen, okay? And the reason for that is living for the sake of others is the root of universal values, okay? And that's where we learn it, is in the family. So back to the existential question. Okay. Can we exist? Can we exist without family? And I would assert that no, it's not really possible. That the society will devolve and degrade and crash, and it won't be sustainable. So that's the end of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, Dr. Richardson. I know that there's a lot of meat in there and a lot of things we can question and talk about. And before we get to do that, we have one more presenter here who's going to talk about these time-honored values and material prosperity as an author. Michael P. Downey has lived in Seoul too. He's for some 21 years, and then he lived another decade in Alaska. And it's his birthday today. So, man, this is a special guy. Anyway, he remains active. He supports North Korean refugees and North and South Korean unification issues. One of his recent books, this one, can you say this? Between Heaven and Earth, it came out last year. It's about the painful escape path of a North Korean woman and her love for family and her people. It's a really a heart-tugging read. So I'm excited to hear from this other approach on this issue of family and values and children and prosperity and all this. Michael Downey, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. I am Michael P. Downey. I live in Bellingham, Washington. But previously I lived in South Korea for 21 years. And during that time I taught English primarily to adults, but also to children, to South Koreans, and also to North Korean refugees, and I wrote books. I think anyone who knows anything about South Korean society will say that there is a crisis of values in South Korean society today. And Dr. Richardson laid out a lot of it, but I want to throw in a different perspective. When we talk about traditional values in South Korea, we cannot ignore Confucianism. Confucianism is really the root of values in Chosun, the last 600 years of South Korea. And today, there's a common expression that everybody knows and most people can relate with. That is Chosun hell. You may have heard that. A couple of people are smiling. Chosun hell describes the circumstance of especially the youth of Korea today. And in some sense, we have to lay the blame for this at the feet of Confucianism. Confucianism is a ethical system where familial relationships are very clearly defined and spelled out for everyone to see. Parents and children, brothers and sisters, the king and the people, all these things are well documented or spelled out in Confucianism. It creates a hierarchy with, some people say, men at the top. Old men at the top. You know, in America, they say old white men, but in Korea, they have, I guess they got old yellow men. But yeah. So we have to lay the blame for some of this at the feet of Confucianism, because this hierarchical society has over time trended toward tyranny. One of the first things, one of my first impressions of South Korea when I moved there was the role of women in South Korean society. At that time, I was teaching a lot of female housewives, and they were all telling me the same thing. How much they dreaded, how much they hated Korean traditional holidays. For example, Chuseok, which is the Thanksgiving holiday, and Sonal, which is the Lunar New Year holiday. They hated these holidays. They dreaded their coming, and they tried to avoid them if at all possible. And the reason is the heavy burden of those family celebrations always falls on the women. The women are required to do the shopping, to do the cooking, to do the serving, to do the dishwashing, and to do it over and over again for 3 days. Especially if you are married to the Funabaji, the oldest son in the family, then your holiday is truly hell. And so I realized that there was a unequal burden put on Korean women, and they definitely reacted to it. The way to prosperity in Korea, they say, is education. So they have a passion for education, and education for them means attending the university, and if at all possible, attending one of the elite universities. They have what they call the Sky University. Sky, SKY, is Seoul National University, Korea University, and Yonsei University. These are the three elite universities. And if you are talented enough or lucky enough to enter one of these three universities, then your future is almost guaranteed. But there's a huge number of students who are trying to enter the university and trying to enter Sky University, and the competition is brutal. Competition for everything in South Korea is brutal. It's a small country with a very large and dense population, and they compete intensely for everything, especially for a place at an elite university. Recently, well, let's say in the past 20 years, Korean families have become smaller. There used to be families with typical families had 6, 5, 4 children. Beginning about 20 years ago, I saw that drop and drop and drop, where families were having only 3 children or only 2 children, or nowadays that many families have only 1 child. If that child is a girl, then they want all the blessings of prosperity for that girl. They want to educate her. They push her to enter a university and a elite university. And from my experience, I learned that girls are a lot better students than boys. That girls, for some reason, I think it's because they want to, they really want to please parents. They want to bring home a good grade to get praise from their parents, from their teachers, and so they're very diligent academic life. They study very well. On the other hand, boys, after they reach a certain level, the minimum required level, after that, they want to play video games. So in the universities, the best students are always girls. And after they graduate from the university, they have a tough time getting employment. If you graduate from a Sky University, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a job. But many of the other students who graduate from other universities, they really struggle to get a job. And so there's a huge competition between boys and girls getting a job. And nowadays, many women are successful finding employment and many boys are not. Well, if you don't have a job, for a young man, it's really tough. He's really living in Chosun hell. He can't find a job. He's probably living at home with his parents, hanging out with his buddies and playing video games. He definitely is not dating young women. And if he's not dating young women, there's not much chance he's going to eventually marry one of them. And so there's a lot of despair. Chosun hell, the only solution is immigrate to another country. So boys have it pretty tough. Girls are quite successful in entering the job market, more so than boys, I think. And they enter the job market around 25 years old. So from the mid to their late 20s, they're really focused on their career. They're not focused on getting married. When they hit about 32, they may start thinking about getting married. When they hit 35 or around 38 years old, then the biological clock kicks in. Now they want to get married. And they look around and there's no one who is, there are very few men who are at their professional or educational level. So they really have a hard time getting married. So they're also suffering in Chosun hell. And this, as I mentioned, the solution to Chosun hell is immigration. So many Korean young people want to immigrate to America. If not America, to Australia or to England or to another country where they don't have to live in Chosun hell.
Wow.
So it is, oh yeah, this is the reality. And then you have the feminists and you have the radical feminists. And I always hear a lot about from my male students, they always talk to me about the radical feminists. And anyway, it's a kind of a bleak future for them. So in one sense, we can say that this is the fault of Confucianism, the tyranny of Confucianism. What's the solution? What are you going to do? You're going to tell girls they can't go to school, they can't go to the university, they can't have a career. That's a hard sell for women and also parents of women.
Wow. I'm sure you're kind of gearing up for some point. We have one more speaker who's going to talk about this. So
Okay.
if you can bring your comments to a conclusion, would be awesome.
Okay. So what I'm telling my students nowadays is be very careful. Even though they rant and rail against Confucianism, I tell them, don't throw the baby out with the water. Confucianism actually has some very good points by establishing the standard of relationship between parents and children, brothers and sisters, king or leader and the people. it goes a long way to promote very stable family relationships. And so I tell them, if you want to immigrate to America, be careful, because once you get to America, you're going to find a social system that is really different than the one you find in Korea, where many people, maybe most people, are divorced at least once. And so the family in America is often unstable. On the other hand, in Korea, because of Confucianism, the standard is the family is often very stable. And so I advise people to don't throw the baby out with water. That means you have to divide the good points of Confucianism from the bad points. Good points is a strong family system. The importance of marriage and lineage are all contribute towards the stability of families. But forcing people to get married is not good. Anyway, we have to divide the good points of Confucianism and promote them, and point out the bad points of Confucianism. Okay, that'll do it.
Thank you. Michael, you really put some firebrand into this. Chosun hell, education, so young men running away and young women fearing holidays coming up. Wow, this is a firebrand. So we have one. Thank you very much for livening us up here. We got one other presenter, and she is Kana Orikasa. She studied in South Korea from 2015 through 2020 and graduated with a degree in global tourism from Sun Moon University. And as a foreigner, she learned about modern Korean society through Koreans, both at work and in school. And as an American, she experienced introducing American culture and teaching English to Korean students. And she is still teaching English or Korean now, teaching Korean online. And in America since 2021, she also does Korean English translation. And we are so happy to have Kana here to solve all our problems. Thank you. Take it away, Kana. Mute, unmute. Are you unmuted on your side? EJ? Can we get unmute on Kana? I think can you try to unmute yourself? No. Oh, there.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I just want to speak about this issue from a youth perspective. So, as we have heard, Korea has a very, very competitive society from a very young age. Even I think pre-K, they want their children to start learning English. I remember I went to one nursery school to introduce the alphabet and teach them about American culture, because parents know that knowing English is a really, really important kind of skill that they need to succeed in society. So secondary school is especially competitive, and getting into a good middle school and high school, it determines going into a good college, university, which will ultimately land you a good job working in a very big company such as Samsung or LG. Those are what people aim for, but it is very, very competitive, as we have heard. And so that's just kind of the background of Korea. And so when considering what is more important, it's kind of changed. In the past, Korea was very work oriented and succeeding to support their family. But as the time changed, especially recently, it's shifted to a point where people value both work and their own personal life. So as you can see from this chart, around 2017, it became more equal, people who valued work and people who valued both. And then now, though, there are people that value both a lot more than they do work. So it's kind of shifting to a more work balance kind of life. And so one interesting thing about the youth, from around 2018, when I was in Korea, I started hearing the word woraber. It's a Korean kind of acronym. Koreans like creating these buzzwords. And it just comes from the English word work-life balance. So this kind of word started trending, especially for young people. I think millennials and Generation Z, they started trying to pursue this work-life balance. Traditionally, it was really work was really important. People sacrificed their own lives for their work and really competed with each other for this. But now people are starting to see that work is not as important, that their own individual, their health, their mentality is important as well. So this is what young people are valuing more these days. And so if you look on Instagram, this term "woraber" has become a really popular hashtag. These are kind of the things that you would see on social media, people going on vacation, camping, just going to a cafe and reading books. So this is what young people are trying to pursue more. And if you look at this study, when looking at jobs, when people are looking at jobs, a lot of people, about 58.9%, look for a good work-life balance, opposed to just wages. Of course, that comes in second, and good benefits come in after that. But this is kind of the first time where good work-life balance has become a priority for young people. And especially, this is a survey that was asking, are you practicing work-life balance in your own life? And as you can see here, people in their 20s and 30s responded higher than people in their 40s. So this is why young people are trying to take care of their own selves rather than just their work life. And this is another survey on millennials and Generation Z, their perception on work. So 66.5% preferred work-life balance in their life, and then of course fair compensation and welfare system, etc. But this is how important work-life balance has become. And so let's see. Generally, there's a lot of change in values. The older generation, they focused more on preparing for the future and preferred a stable lifetime workplace. They land a job somewhere, they work there for a long time. And this thing called passion pay is, when new workers, interns, and newly hired employees, they have to go through a lot of suffering and kind of with low pay, but they're kind of devoted to their work. And the way they selected their job was based on salary. Whereas the younger generation, my generation, a lot of my friends too, they would rather enjoy life at the moment and secure their youth, which is not wasting their time in work. And people generally do not want to work in the same place for a long time. They would maybe think 10 years is enough, and then they'll go look to work somewhere else, even overseas. And for their job selection standard, they want somewhere that supports work-life balance. So even among my friends, there's a lot of people. First, I'd like to contrast. When I look at social media, a lot of my American friends, my friends from high school, I noticed that a lot of them were being engaged and even having children. And compared to them, I felt, oh, I'm kind of behind in life. But then if I look at my Korean friends, what they're doing, a lot of them are still job hunting or trying to look for internships. The most successful people got hired immediately after graduating, or they got some kind of internship while they were in school. But a lot of people right now, actually, they're still finding a lot of difficulty getting their dream job. A lot of people just end up working in a convenience store. I have one friend who majored in the same thing as me, tourism. She has been spending a lot of time studying English and practicing interviews just to get a job. And so she is trying to come to America to work. She does not want to work in Korea. She's trying to work at a resort here in America, but even that's taking a long time, with visa sponsors. And so it's very frustrating. And in Korea, I have another friend who's working at a convenience store. She complains a lot about how hard life is in Korea because it's really expensive to live there. Housing is expensive, food is expensive. I remember fruits. It's so common in America, but you take it for granted because in Korea, fruit is really expensive. So just life in general, for one person to live, it's really expensive. So people don't have the time to think about family either. So it's really, young people really don't want the burden of taking care of a family because they themselves are struggling to find jobs and support themselves. So it's shifting really from a family kind of society and culture to the individual. But it's not individualistic like America, but still Koreans are kind of shifting towards, taking care of their mental, physical health more, not really rushing into starting a family. Like we said, people get married maybe in their mid-30s. That's become the norm. And overall, I think there are many reasons that people choose not to marry. Koreans have high expectations. One reason that both men and women agree on is that they cannot meet a partner that is up to their expectation. And a lot of women actually want to achieve their individual goals rather than marry. And for men, low income was a big reason that they didn't marry. And so, yeah, another reason people don't have a lot of children is because education, despite being really, really developed, it's very expensive too. Korea is one of the most expensive places to raise a child. And so these kind of things discourage youth from starting family, and they would rather just focus on their individual kind of dreams and that kind of, rather not family, not necessarily jobs either, but really just self-care. So that's what I've noticed with some of my friends in university and throughout my time in Korea. And yeah, that's just all I would like to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kana. Thank you very much. It's this was from the ground, and I appreciate your mentioning the work-home balance, and that young people are kind of inching their way back in that direction. And while you've been speaking here, there's been going on a whole bunch of discussion on the chat, as you might see there. It's one question there. There are several questions. It's one about perfection, and we find that everything should be perfect in education, and it's Dan Hess addressing it to Michael Downey there. I feel like you are describing that Korea has a crisis of perfectionism. Many people have such a high standard that when perfect conditions are not there, then people give up. Is that what you say? Do you have any comment on that?
Okay, yeah. There's a high standard. And what drives that? I'm not sure what drives that, but there is a very high standard. When I first went to Korea, they said in order to get married, you need to have a good job. Good job is not a construction job. Good job is an office job at a conglomerate, one of the chaebols. Number two, you have to have a patu. A patu is the high-rise apartments. And number three, you have to have a car. If you don't have those three, you have no hope of getting married or even dating a woman.
Thank you. Thank you. Kana, if I can ask you something here, it says, Wayne Hankins says, I didn't hear the words happiness and freedom that are so common here in the US with young people. Do you have any comparison to make between Korea and Japan and Korea and America in that?
Well, first of all, yeah, definitely happiness and freedom is something that Koreans really find in their own lives. They look at other countries, you know, maybe America or Australia, and they want to go abroad because they believe they can find a lot more freedom there. Korea, because it's such a competitive society, and also because there's really high standards to really be able to fit these standards, it's really stressful. So they really don't feel a lot of freedom. You know, even in class, in America, university, people would raise their hand, open discussions. But in Korea, if a professor asks you, does anybody have a question? It's kind of common to know that nobody actually has a question because nobody has the freedom to be able to express themselves. So self-expression is really difficult in Korea too. Similar to Japan, Koreans, they feel kind of, you know, pressured by society. So this kind of self-expression, they don't, I also didn't find it in Korea. There's not a lot of freedom. Even the way you dress, there's like a certain style, certain trend that people follow. If you don't follow that, people kind of look at you weirdly. So freedom and happiness, it's really hard to find in Korea for Koreans, I think.
Thank you, thank you. And do you have any comment, Kana, on what was brought up of Chosun Hell for especially women and making holiday stuff and the rigid Confucian roles of expectations of women? Do you have any comment on that?
I definitely agree on that. I don't know, of course, I didn't personally go through it, but even in our culture classes, we learned about how Koreans, I met with a lot of high school students. They really don't have a lot of time for themselves. They're studying so hard for these exams. And once you go to university, though, it's the complete opposite. Actually, in America, high school, you have fun. University, you actually study hard and become serious. But in Korea, high school, you're serious. And once you get to university, it's all kind of downhill from there, depending, of course, on the university. In my university, it was relatively easy to get into. So people were not putting so much effort in class. They were, you know, having fun, just drinking or going out. So once they're liberated from that Joseon hell, that's mostly secondary school, then yeah, people really want to forget about all the suffering that they went through. So in university, they just, they try to be as free as they can. And holidays too, people, families, well, maybe they'll spend time with their nuclear family. Not many people go all the way to their grandmother's house so much these days. So that's very true.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Richardson here. Eric, we talked about the concentration of population in the chat, or you've been writing about that 50% of the South Korea population live within just a few kilometers from Seoul. And then it's another additional desire to have an apartment in a high rise. Why do you think that is such a concentration? What's the drive for that?
The modern apartments are usually, if you can afford to get a modern apartment, it's pretty spacious and it's modern, right? It has all the conveniences. There's no bugs, and you don't have to take care of the yard. Right? So it's a lot of conveniences in having an apartment, and also because the population's so concentrated in the apartments, if you're having children, there's a little bit of concentration on whether or not you can have play space for your children, but more important is whether or not there's good hagwons close by.
Yeah. Schooling again, yes.
So I think when you talk about chosen hell, I think part of the problem is that actually you start at a pretty young age, right? Where you start expecting the kids to do things and they kind of miss their childhood. I think in the old days, we've kind of like, we've destroyed the childhood, like when you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so that there's not a lot of playtime still even then. And after that, we kind of expected young children to start becoming young adults. And then somewhere along the line, we invented this term adolescence, right? And now adolescence can be anywhere between 12 and 34, right? So,
yeah,
this idea of perfectionism, I wrote something in the chat about that. And to me, we've this illusion that everything has to be perfect before you get married. And if it's not, then it's like spouse abuse and child abuse, right? If you haven't, gotten your education, gotten your house, gotten your job, gotten your career, amassed some certain amount of money, then you shouldn't be getting married. And that's true for both men and women, right? And so we've delayed this whole idea of having a family until somebody's 31 or 32. And by that time, for a lot of people, the options for having children become very limited. The options for getting married become very limited. And
yeah, thank you. That's reality, and the marriage rate, average marriage time is in the 30s in Korea, as you pointed out. So thank you.
I'd like to make one more point about that, which is the object of getting married and having a lifelong partner is that you can become really close to that person. And part of becoming really close to that person is sharing all those challenges, right? So you get married young, so you don't have a lot of money, you don't have your education, but working through those challenges together is what makes your life solid, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great point. I like to call on the chairman of UPF here in the US, in America, and the president of UPF in the world, Dr. Michael Jenkins, to get on and give us some more wisdom to this wonderful discussion.
Hey,
I'm so
Dr.
glad
Berg.
to have you here.
Dr. Berg, I'm so grateful for this International Association of Academicians for Peace that you're heading up for UPF USA. I want to thank Dr. Richardson, Mr. Michael Downey, who's been a regular guest on some of our programs. And Kana, it's so good to see you. I've met you many times in Oklahoma, there with your family, and really proud of you to have this experience worldwide and be guiding us. So I just have a couple quick questions. One is to Kana. What do young people think about the North Korean situation? Are they worried about it, or do they want to come together with North Korea, or do they see how dark it is when the light, a satellite photo is shown at nighttime? What do your perspective of young people thinking about North Korea?
Yeah, actually, I hardly hear about North Korea and South Korea. Americans make a much bigger deal out of it, despite being far away. Koreans, they're not very afraid of North Korea. I think, I don't really hear about people fearing. Of course, they know, I think maybe if anything, North Korean refugees, there's kind of more talk about that. But in general, Koreans, I think they're aware, but they're not that concerned about North Korea. Maybe they're not actually, North Koreans are not very welcomed so much in South Korea. Either they're still seen as foreigners despite having the same ancestors. So I've never met a North Korean, but there are some, education about lectures about North Korea, but I think America sees it as a much bigger issue than the South Koreans themselves.
Thank you, Kana. It's so good to see you. Very good. It's very interesting that young people do not feel a threat from the North. That's what I've read and heard from many young people. So that's a very interesting perspective. How do they feel about President Yoon? Do you know? Did young people vote for President Yoon wanting a difference, or?
Well, I don't know about now because that's very recent, but with Moon Jae-in, the previous president, a lot of people didn't support him. I think they didn't really agree with his policies. But yeah, I kind of stayed out of the politics in Korea. Don't want to get too involved in the trouble there. So I'm not much of an expert on that field.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Richardson, what can revive the birth rate in Korea? What can be done to bring it back to 2.1? And is it just the modernization and following the industrialized trends of society? Or is there something particular that makes Korea among it may be the lowest in the world or the second lowest, I forget. Why is it with such a strong family, Confucian culture, and one of the strongest bases of Christianity there in Korea, in all of Asia, is right there. About a third of the population, or maybe 29%, is really strong Christian. What's going on? Why are they having a problem with the birth rate?
Well, I think, to start with, I don't really know, but I think that we've come to a place where people first off, they're afraid of the family, right? They've seen arguments with their parents. They've seen parents that were together, but not really together. Okay. In terms of, there's a very undercurrent of society there where it seems to be very prim and proper, but in reality, there's a lot of sex work, and the corporate culture in the past has been such that the people who get those perfect office jobs were expected to go out and drinking till late at night, and often involved sexual encounters, that kind of thing. And I think that kids grew up with the conflicts that arose from those kind of situations, and that their parents, their father in particular, may not have been home very often, and they didn't feel like that was a really a good environment. And so what can be done is going back to the idea of intentional education, of trying to inspire people to what the real ideal is and that it's possible, right? And help them, educate them to be able to live and communicate. So even the idea, that the holidays are such a hellish experience for some of the women involved, right? Mm-hmm. But part of that is an inability to communicate and ask, and expect to receive it, right? To be able to ask for help and expect to receive it. But that's a question of, again, how can we educate people so that they communicate honestly and they seek to build relationships where they're, the Bible tells us that woman and men are supposed to be helpmates, right? They're supposed to help each other, and not one does one thing and the other does the other. So how can we educate people to be able to communicate and share their experiences and be able to get the things that need to be done together? So
very good. Very good. Understand. Wow. Mr. Downey, I've never heard about radical feminism in Korea. But, But I do know that the Korean women that I have known throughout my life are incredibly, very, very people of character, heart, and determination. And I just know one thing for sure: once a Korean woman makes up her mind, you might as well just cooperate with her, whether it's a grandma or whether it's, one of your sisters, and especially my friends who are married to Koreans, they all have a lot of, respect for the Korean woman, but also it is really a strong culture. Is the mother kind of the center of the family still, from your perspective? I mean, in terms of
Yes,
together?
but the family becomes smaller and smaller. I was speaking to a small group of young men last night. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, what happened?
We hear you.
Oh, you're still
fine,
there.
you're fine.
We
Okay.
hear you.
Okay, I'm going to return to meeting. Okay, so I was speaking to a small group of young men last night, and I asked them a very similar question. I asked them, what will lead towards the solution to the demographic problem in South Korea?
Hmm.
What will make women want to get married and
Wow.
young men want to get married? And this is what they said. Number one, you have to solve the housing problem.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
In South Korea, there's a huge problem of lack of housing in the places where people want to live. And it drives up a small apartment will sell for $1.2 million.
Hmm.
And then it
Wow.
becomes, and they can't mortgage it out 35 years. They
Wow.
gotta, if they get a mortgage, it's gonna be more like 10 years.
Wow. Wow. So housing, serious problem.
Oh, it's a very serious problem. And the Korean, successive Korean governments have tried to solve the problem, but they can't solve it. The problem is too many people want to live in Seoul or Gyeonggi-do. The
I see.
Gyeonggi-do is the county that surrounds Seoul.
Wow. Wow. Okay. That's, Dr. Berg, thank you, Michael. Dr. Berg, just so great to be here with you. Thank you for organizing these wonderful academic sessions. And I think I'll turn it back over to you. I think Dr. Richardson has something to share too.
Just a quick point, not to be too cynical about it, but the population crisis means that housing is going to become cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some years, right? Yes.
Yeah, in a few years.
In a few years. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And
Thank you.
yes.
But part of the problem is it's the same problem in America, right? So my father's generation, when he came back from World War I or World War II, right? They were very happy to live in cracker boxes, right? So, but the current generation, they want a 1/4 acre of land with a 4-bedroom house and a huge kitchen with an island in it. And, right? If you can't do that, then they don't want it. So those houses run $400,000, whereas the cracker box might run 80.
Well, yeah, that price is even higher, I would think, these days. Desirable neighborhood in San Francisco or New York or wherever. Yes, housing, that's another topic for another day. So thank you for giving me some ideas here. There are a lot of ideas floating around. I don't know if you followed the chat, but it's been another seminar going on there. So thank you for all your comments, Kana and Eric, and everything's going on here in multiple levels, spoken and unspoken. And these seminars actually come on every week at the same time at Eastern time, 2 p.m. And I'm in the Pacific time zone here at 11 a.m. We discuss these issues about South Korea, North Korea, Korea from different viewpoints, because Korea certainly is a bellwether for the world. That means somehow concentrated issues are there. So if we can solve the housing issue, the baby issue, the perfectionism issue, the the money issue, the holiday celebration issue. I mean, there are so many issues to solve here. So I'm sure we can get a few more weeks to talk about it. So I look forward to see you next week at the same time on another topic. So stay tuned. And I want to thank you all for attending this program. And even if there were many questions that we didn't have time to get to, maybe it can just stimulate each and every one of us to look into the questions on our own and come up with some other good answers to them to help those in need. Anyway, Dr. Richardson, Michael Downey, Kana, wonderful to have you on. Dr. Jenkins, thank you for popping in and saying a few words. And my apologies for drawing over, but we still have more to talk about. So anyway, next week, continue. Thank you so much. Over and out.
It was nice to meet you, Kana.